Loyalty Binds Me, The Life of King Richard III. Episode 2. The precise point at which Richard made his way into the far north of England and the household of his famous cousin Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, isn't certain. It was once thought that he spent most of the 1460s there, but it was actually a much shorter period than that, though no less influential. The first reference to Richard being in Warwick's care appears in the teller's roll in late 1465. Edward gave Warwick the huge sum of £1,000 towards the cost of caring for and educating the king's youngest brother. It's not clear whether these costs had already been incurred or whether the money travelled north with Richard. The young Duke had witnessed official documents in Westminster as late as 1463, so spent at least a couple of years under his brother's wing in London. Richard slips from view a little during his time in Warwick's care. Most of his days were probably spent at Middleham Castle, the stout fortress that was the centre of Neville power in the north. He'd have travelled around too, accompanying his mentor to other properties such as Sheriff Hutton, and to York, the effective capital of the north. Approaching his teens, Richard would have begun to see how households were run, the levers of authority that allowed a lord to control his affinity and run his estates efficiently, and the ways in which loyalty was won and retained. Nothing specific is known of Richard's education during this period, but it would have followed the standard curriculum of academic skills, mathematics, reading and writing, Latin and philosophy. Alongside these, Richard would learn to be a knight, training with different weapons, with a bow, and mastering fighting from horseback. Hunting in the sprawling Wensleydale countryside on Neville estates would help to hone the skills needed to survive and flourish on a battlefield. As an adult, Richard would own an extensive library, including many chivalric romances, so it seems likely he developed a taste for learning and for knightly tales of bravery. 3 other important things happened during this period of Richard's life. The first was the company of a younger boy who would remain a lifelong friend. Francis Lovell was 4 years younger than Richard. His father had been a Lancastrian, and on his death, Francis became a ward of the king and was filtered into Warwick's care. For the next 20 years, Richard and Francis would remain what can only be described as best friends. The second important encounter was with the girl who would one day become Richard's wife. Warwick had no sons and 2 daughters, Isabel and Anne. It's possible Warwick hoped for a match between one of them and his influential young ward. Isabel was a year older than Richard, and Anne was almost 4 years his junior. On the 22nd of September 1465, several days of feasting began to celebrate the enthronement of Warwick's younger brother, George Neville, as Archbishop of York. It was a conspicuously lavish affair designed to display Neville wealth and authority, just as Warwick's influence with the king he had helped to create was beginning to wane. The ceremony and accompanying feasts exposed Richard to the way a lord kept tight the ties of loyalty with open-handed generosity to his retainers. In this way, a lord could show his power and give a taste of the rewards available to those who aligned themselves with him. The important element for our story is that the seating plan for the main feast has survived. Richard was at a table with his sister Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk, who he may not have known all that well, but who was nevertheless a sibling visiting him in a remote place. She sat on his right, and to his left was the Countess of Westmoreland, but also at the table were the daughters of Warwick. We can place Richard with Anne, his future wife, on at least this occasion, though they may well have spent time together at Middleham, in lessons perhaps, aside from this. There's been much speculation about the nature of Richard and Anne's later relationship. We can never really know what went on behind doors that were closed over 500 years ago, but it was at least a relationship based on some degree of familiarity. It was also during this part of Richard's life that the scoliosis seen when his remains were discovered by the Looking for Richard project would have begun to curve his spine. It must have been a trying, even frightening time for Richard. In an age when physical deformity was often equated to a corruption of the soul, Richard had to worry not only about what others thought of him, but what God may mean by such an affliction. It would have affected his physical training, and it's to be wondered how well he hid the worsening curvature and accompanying pain from those in Warwick's household. He'd do a pretty good job of keeping it quiet for the rest of his life. As the problem persisted and worsened rather than going away, Richard must have realised that his hopes of matching his brother's huge frame and fearsome reputation on the battlefield were ebbing away, and in an age before effective pain relief, the constant discomfort must have been trying on a teenage boy. In 1466, Richard was invested into the Order of the Garter, England's premier chivalric brotherhood, but he must have become increasingly concerned that he would never be able to live up to the expectations of others, let alone those he imposed on himself. During the following year, Richard was the subject of a suggested marriage to Joan, the 2-year-old daughter of King Louis XI of France. Ultimately, the age gap was too serious a problem, since Richard would have been around 30 before it would have been possible to think about children. It's likely that it was during the same year, 1467, that Richard was extracted from Warwick's household as relations between the king and his most powerful subject soured and rumbled towards conflict. Edward wanted his little brother out of the way of any fallout, and from Warwick's influence that might alienate him from the king. All change again. As the 15-year-old Richard looked towards the end of the 1460s, he could reflect on many lessons learned and several turns of fortune's wheel. He could also look forward to taking a more active role in his brother's regime. A medieval nobleman was usually deemed to have reached the age of majority at 21, but it could be reached earlier, and as Edward found himself in need of props, his youngest brother was the ideal candidate to step into the light of national politics. We think of Richard now as a northerner. Indeed, the perception that he descended on London from the wild north was part of his problem in 1483. For many, he's considered the only king of England to have been a northerner, even if he wasn't really, at least not by birth. At the end of the 1460s though, his path seemed to lie in a very different direction. The Neville family still had a firm grip on the north, and were still nominally loyal to Edward, even if the ties that bound them were beginning to unravel. George was still Edward's heir. The king had so far had only daughters, Elizabeth in 1466, Mary in 1467, and Cecily would arrive in the spring of 1469, but as yet there was no son to displace George, who was set up in the northern and western Midlands and across towards Cheshire. Edward himself held the southeast, centred on the capital in London. This left a gaping hole that had always been a Lancastrian region and needed to be brought under firm Yorkist control. Richard received a clutch of properties in Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, Dorset, Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. He was given Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, which might well have made a perfect base from which to secure the West Country and the southern Welsh marches for his brother. It seems likely that Edward saw the gap in his authority in this region as the perfect place for his brother, especially as Duke of Gloucester, to represent him. Relations with Warwick spiralled out of control quickly. Before long, Warwick and George were in open rebellion against Edward, with George, married to Warwick's eldest daughter Isabel, against Edward's command. The king was captured, but Warwick found it impossible to rule in Edward's name while the king was a prisoner, so was forced to release his cousin. Edward made a great show of forgiving Warwick, but the problems were far from solved. During the uprising, Warwick had taken the chance to rid himself of a couple of rivals. He'd executed Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, the king's father-in-law, along with one of the Queen's brothers. Rivers had been High Constable of England, one of the great offices of state. Richard was already Admiral, and now he was appointed Constable too by his brother. With the exception of some months that were fast approaching, this is an office that Richard would hold until he became king some 14 years later. The powers it gave him were broad and deep, and will become important later on, but for now, it's enough to know that Richard spent his entire adult life with these powers at his disposal. Amongst the lands found to help Richard support himself was a seat in the Duchy of Lancaster, providing a handsome income of £1,000 a year. These placed him into conflict with the most powerful man in the duchy, Thomas Lord Stanley. This rivalry would haunt Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 15 years' time. He was also given offices in Wales with responsibility for law and order, and on the 16th of December 1469, Richard was sent to recapture the castles of Carmarthen and Cardigan. They'd been snatched in the mounting unrest by Morgan and Henry, two sons of Grufford ap Nicholas. It had the ring of a test to it for the 17-year-old, though sadly precisely how it all played out is nowhere recorded. The castles were recovered without major military incident, and here again we can see problems being stored up for later. Another of Grufford's sons was Rhys ap Thomas, the man Welsh bards claimed struck the killing blow to Richard's head at Bosworth. One Welsh bard recalled that Richard had met 4 brothers, sons of Grufford, and the matter between them had been resolved. It seems possible that Rhys was one of these brothers. Had he perhaps held a grudge for 1/4 of a century when he took to the field at Bosworth? At 17, Richard was becoming a truly national figure, holding offices of state, appearing on royal commissions, and gathering lands in an area traditionally beyond Yorkist control. A storm was brewing in Edward IV's England though, and soon Richard would be forced to take a side. On one, his oldest brother and king. On the other, the brother he was closest to, George, and his cousin and former mentor, the famous Earl of Warwick. On the 26th of March 1470, Richard had finished his work in Wales and was at Hornby Castle in Lancashire. He may have travelled north to inspect the new properties in the duchy, where he had replaced Thomas Lord Stanley as Steward of Holton and of Widnes, as well as being given Stanley's office of Master Forester of Amounderness. Richard may have been sent to deliberately step on Stanley's toes. He held immense power in the Duchy of Lancaster, which meant that he could put huge numbers of men into the field if he wished. His loyalties, though, had always been a little bit suspect, and Edward couldn't afford to be uncertain now. Richard had missed the Battle of Losecoat Field on the 12th of March because he'd been in Wales and then travelling north. The engagement saw Edward rout a rebel army, but there was no longer any doubt that both Warwick and George were neck deep in the revolt, planning to replace Edward with George. It must have been a difficult and awkward moment for Richard. Edward was not only his king, but had become like a father to him. George had been his constant companion throughout their childhood. Now he would have to choose between them. We know that Richard was at Hornby Castle on the 26th of March because he'd involved himself in another bitter dispute, treading even more firmly on the toes of Thomas Lord Stanley. Hornby Castle had long been the home of the Harrington family. The current head of the Harringtons was Sir James, who had been in Wales with Richard and had travelled north in his company. James's father, Sir Thomas, had been killed at the Battle of Wakefield, fighting for Richard's father, the Duke of York. Alongside Thomas, his oldest son, Sir John Harrington, had also lost his life at Wakefield. Reports from the battlefield suggest that Thomas was killed during the fighting and that John died of his wounds shortly afterwards. That meant, however briefly, John had inherited his father's lands, and on his own death they passed to his two daughters. James had tried to argue that John had in fact died first, so that his second son, James, had inherited on Thomas's death, but that was probably just a desperate attempt to cover up the truth. The problem for the Harringtons was that the family's estates now rested on two unmarried young girls and would ultimately go to their husbands. Lord Stanley was quick to use his connections at court to arrange for one of the daughters to marry one of his own sons and the other to marry a nephew. The voraciously expansionist Stanley family claimed all that belonged to the Harringtons, including the jewel in their crown, Hornby Castle. James took his nieces and barricaded himself in, refusing to give the castle over to Stanley. The matter went to court, and Edward IV ordered James to surrender Hornby and his nieces to Lord Stanley, but still James refused. As tensions grew and law and order broke down in England, Lord Stanley took the opportunity to circumvent the lengthy court proceedings. He had a huge cannon named Mile End brought up from Bristol, intending to blow the walls apart if he had to. No shot was ever fired at Hornby though. The reason is simple to discern. On the 26th of March, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, signed a document given under our signet at the Castle of Hornby. At 17, the Duke had placed himself within James Harrington's castle and dared Thomas Stanley to fire a cannon at the King's brother. The moment says a lot about Richard. The Harrington family had been unswervingly loyal to the Yorkist cause from its very inception, and he seems to have felt that such commitment warranted better treatment than they were getting. It also shows he wasn't afraid to oppose his brother's decisions when he believed they were wrong. It showed too a dangerous lack of judgment. Edward stepped carefully around the problems with Stanley loyalty because he was so powerful. Richard didn't, and he made even more of an enemy of Thomas Lord Stanley, a decision he can hardly have foreseen would cost him his life 15 years later. The patched over rift between Edward and Warwick burst open again in the late summer of 1470. Warwick had been in France, and the wily Louis XI had pulled off his greatest diplomatic coup to date. He arranged a rapprochement between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife. They'd been mortal enemies. Warwick was largely responsible for Henry's deposing. Now, after the Earl had been kept on bended knee for over a quarter of an hour, Margaret agreed to allow him to help her restore her husband to the throne. Warwick's younger daughter Anne was married to the Lancastrian Prince of Wales, Edward. Warwick set sail for England to make good on his promise. One side effect of all this was that George was relegated in Warwick's plans. The original idea had been to unseat Edward and make George king. Now, the Earl would unseat Edward and restore Henry VI, making Prince Edward next in line for the throne. George's consolation was a written promise that he would be the Lancastrian heir to the throne should Henry VI's line fail, which he can hardly have been happy about. As Warwick moved up from the south coast, his brother John, now Marquis Montague, moved south, and Edward was caught in a trap about to snap shut. The king sent his men away and took ship at King's Lynn with a few close friends, sailing into exile in Burgundy. Richard isn't noted in a source that lists all of those with Edward, and his omission would be odd. William Lord Hastings, Edward's close friend, and the Queen's brother Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, are listed as sailing with him. The Queen went into sanctuary at Westminster with her children, pregnant with a fourth. So where was Richard? No source offers any insight, and Richard seems to disappear for a time. John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, was caught in a forest just southwest of Lynn and received mob justice for his own harsh treatment of prisoners. Known as the Butcher of England, Tiptoft had overseen the impaling of a number of rebels the previous year and lost his own life to his furious captors. I wonder whether Richard wasn't heading off in a similar way, perhaps to shore up support for Edward and put everyone on notice that he would return soon. Given his sphere of influence and recent activity, he might well have been heading for the Yorkist strongholds along the Welsh marches to ensure that they remained loyal. If he did, it was a brave decision. He might have expected fair treatment from Warwick and George, but now the Lancastrian faction was swinging back into control. Whatever Richard was up to, he resurfaces in Veer in Holland in early November, where he borrowed some cash. Richard may well have been at Veer because of the naval threat imposed by Warwick. The Burgundians were terrified of the Earl, and at Veer, construction had begun of Warwick's Gate. There's still a Warwick Street in Veer today that leads to the former site of Warwick's Gate. It seems possible that Richard, as Edward's admiral, was sent to help oversee the preparations to protect the coast from the potential threat of Warwick's ships. This was Richard's second period of exile, this time with his other brother. Once more, his fate was taken out of his own hands. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, had Lancastrian blood, and the dukes had previously been allied to the Lancastrian kings against France, so he wasn't averse to Henry VI's restoration. He'd enjoyed good trade relations with Yorkist England too, so was left in a win-win situation. Charles was primarily concerned with Burgundian independence, and Edward and Richard's break came when Louis XI declared war on Burgundy, which Warwick was obliged to join in with. Suddenly, Burgundy and Edward IV had common cause and common enemies. Charles threw his weight behind the exiled English king, providing Edward with ships and money to launch an invasion of England. Charles hoped primarily to distract Warwick from joining France, but Edward meant to take back his crown once and for all. This would be the final clash between Lancaster and York, and Richard was firmly at his big brother's side.